The rain in Neo-London did not wash away the grime. It only turned the ash into a thick black sludge that clung to the heels of the weary. High above the smog, the shard of light, a tower of impossible gold and crystalline geometry, pierced the heavy clouds, soaking in the rare, artificial radiation of the Solar Hegemony's orbital mirrors. Down in the deep tube, Elowen Vance sat in the hollowed-out shell of an old Baker Street subway carriage, her breath blooming in the frigid air. She was the 20th generation of the Vance Archivists, and her blood carried the weight of 800 years of silent underground waiting. She closed her eyes and the echo began. It wasn't a choice, it was a genetic inheritance. In her mind's eye, the London of 1666 was burning, not from a baker's accident, but from the first kinetic strikes of the Solar Hegemony. She saw the Thames boiling and heard the screams of ancestors she had never met, their terror encoded into her very DNA. This was the long journey of the English remnant. A survival not in the void of space, but in the lightless veins of their own stolen earth. The resonance is peaking, Elowen. A voice crackled through her ghost link. It was Arthur Penhaligon, his voice a rasp of static. The Hegemony's celebratory gala is drawing more power to the shard than the atmospheric filters can handle. The window is opening. Elowen stood, her movements fluid and hauntingly slow. At 42, her slow pulse physiology meant her heartbeat only 20 times a minute, a mutation designed to conserve oxygen in the cramped tunnels. She adjusted her Vantasilk cloak, a garment that swallowed the dim emergency lighting of the tube, making her appear like a hole in reality. "Is Sloane ready?" Elowen asked, her voice low and melodic, carrying the ancient, clipped cadence of a London that had long since been declared extinct by the occupiers. "I'm at the maintenance bulkhead near London Bridge." Sloane's voice came through, sharp and eager. She was a kineticist, her muscles honed by gravity drills to strike with the force of a hydraulic press. "The Hegemony thinks the unsunned are just myths to scare their children. Let's show them what ghosts can do." Elowen stepped out of the carriage. This was the night. 8 centuries of archiving, 8 centuries of genetic refinement, and 8 centuries of justice deferred. They weren't just going to break a tower, they were going to reclaim the sky. Characters, 2,548 total characters. 2,548, the ascent began through the mole drill shafts, clandestine tunnels bored upward through the concrete foundations of the old city into the sleek, pressurized basements of the new. As they climbed, the air changed. The scent of damp ozone and rusted iron gave way to the sterile, perfumed atmosphere of the Hegemony's upper tiers. Elowen felt a phantom itch on her skin. Her body, adapted to the darkness, reacted violently to the proximity of the false Sunday. "Visuals are live," Arthur whispered. Through Elowen's neural implants, she saw the ballroom of the Shard of Light. It was a grotesque display of opulence. High Proctor Kalin stood at the center of a terrace overlooking the smog sea, his skin glowing with a deep artificial bronze. Around him, guests in gold-spun robes laughed, sipping wines grown in orbital gardens while the humans below breathed filtered soot. "Look at them," Sloane spat as she emerged from a vent beside Elowen. "They talk about civilizing this rock, as if they didn't turn it into a tomb first." "Focus, Sloane," Elowen cautioned. She felt the echo surging, a memory of a Vance ancestor being hunted through the ruins of St. Paul's. She pushed it back, grounding herself in the cold steel of the disruptor charge in her palm. "We are not here to be angry. We are here to be the consequence." They moved with shadow efficiency, a style of movement that utilized the blind spots in the Hegemony's automated security. Elowen led them through the servant corridors, her Vantasilk cloak rendering her invisible to the infrared sensors. They passed a group of solar servants, humans whose minds had been scrubbed and replaced with basic service protocols. Elowen didn't look at them. The sight of erased heritage was a wound she couldn't afford to let bleed. "The Nexus is 3 levels up," Arthur reported. "But the security gate is tied to a biological signature. You'll need a proctor's clearance." Elowen watched as a minor official stepped away from the gala toward the washrooms. "I'll handle the signature." Sloane prepped the atmospheric override. "Once I'm in the Nexus, there's no turning back." She intercepted the official in the hallway. It wasn't a fight. It was a surgical application of force. Her slow pulse allowed her to move in the gaps between his panicked breaths. Before he could scream, She had his hand against the scanner and a neural mimic device pressed to his temple. The doors to the inner sanctum hissed open. Characters: 2,612 total characters. 5,160. The solar nexus was the heart of the hegemony's power in Britain. It was a cathedral of light, dominated by a rotating sphere of pure energy that hummed with the trapped power of the sun. This machine didn't just provide power, it maintained the solar apartheid, creating the invisible thermal barriers that kept the smog in the streets and the warmth in the towers. "I'm at the console," Elowen whispered. Her fingers danced over the holographic interface, her mind battling the alien architecture of the hegemony's logic. "Arthur, I need the archive decryption key. The one encoded in the 14th generation. Sending it now." Elowen sensors are picking up a security spike. They know there's a breach. Sloane is engaging. The sound of muffled explosions echoed through the vents. Elowen's heart rate spiked to 30 beats a minute, a dangerous frenzy for her kind. She saw Sloane on the security feed. A whirlwind of kinetic energy, crushing hegemony drones with her bare hands to keep the hallway clear. But there were too many. A squad of solar paladins, armored in light reflective plating, was closing in. "Sloane, get out of there," Elowen commanded. "No time, Elle." Sloane's voice was strained, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of combat. "The archive needs to be heard. I'll seal the sector. Just make sure they see the rain." A blast of white light filled the screen as Sloane detonated her remaining kinetic cells, collapsing the corridor and sealing Elowen inside the nexus. The ghost link to Sloane went silent. Elowen stood frozen for a split second, the echo of Sloane's sacrifice weaving itself into the ancestral tapestry of her mind. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She slammed the decryption key into the nexus. The sphere of energy began to pulse erratically, shifting from a stable gold to a violent, flickering red. "Who are you?" A voice boomed, vibrating through the floorboards. Elowen turned. High Proctor Kalen stood at the entrance, flanked by his personal guard. He didn't look angry. He looked genuinely confused. He peered at Elowen's pale skin and silver eyes as if she were a ghost from a fairy tale. "You are one of the unsunned," Kalen said, his voice dripping with aristocratic fascination. "I thought your kind had finally faded into the mud. How did a primitive thing like you climb so high?" "We didn't climb, Proctor," Elowen replied, her voice cold and steady as the deep earth. "Chung tua chi cho doi cho din kai su kion geo kwa kakong lam cho kakong mukwang." Characters: 2,704 total characters. 7,864. Kalen laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Waiting? You've spent 8 centuries in the dirt while we built a paradise. We saved this world from its own filth. We gave it order. We gave it the sun. You stole the sky," Elowen countered, stepping toward the control sphere. "You burned our cities and called it the cleansing. You turned our history into a footnote. But footnotes are where the truth is hidden. The truth is whatever survives," Kalen sneered, signaling his guards. "And you will not survive this night." Before the guards could fire, Elowen triggered the redistribution. The solar nexus didn't explode. It inverted. The massive energy sphere began to suck the light out of the room, plunging the shard into a darkness it hadn't known since its foundation. A low guttural roar shook the tower as the atmospheric filters reversed their polarity. "What have you done?" Kalen shrieked, his bronze skin graying in the sudden shadow. "I've restored the balance," Elowen said. "The archive is being broadcast on every hegemony frequency. Every ship, every spire, every mind link. They are seeing the fire of 1666. They are hearing the names of the millions you erased." The walls of the shard began to groan under the sudden pressure change. Outside, the sea of smog was being sucked upward, channeled through the tower's own ventilation system and vented into the stratosphere. The artificial warmth of Neo-London vanished, replaced by the biting, honest chill of a British winter. Elowen felt the echo in her mind reach a crescendo. Thousands of voices, the Vance line, the millions of Londoners were no longer screaming. They were speaking in unison. "Remember. Justice. Home." She moved past the disoriented guards, her Vantasilk cloak making her a part of the new darkness. Kalen fell to his knees, gasping as the ash air he had forced upon the world below began to flood the gala floors. The gold on his robes tarnished instantly in the toxic flow. "Arthur," Elowen called out. "Is the archive clear?" "It's everywhere, El." Arthur's voice was thick with emotion. "The whole city. They're looking at the screens. They're seeing the truth. And the sky. Elowen, look at the sky." Elowen reached the balcony of the Nexus. The golden mirrors in orbit were shattering, their power backfed by the Nexus's collapse. Above her, for the first time in 800 years, the heavy artificial clouds broke. Characters: 2,715 total characters. 10,579. It didn't happen all at once. The transition from the false sun to the true dark was a slow, agonizing birth. Elowen stood on the precipice of the Shard's balcony, the wind whipping her silver-streaked hair across her face. The air was no longer sterile. It tasted of salt from the distant sea and the ancient metallic tang of the city's bones. Below her, Neo London was a dying jewel. The lights of the Hegemony's spires flickered and died as the power grid, built on the singular hub of the solar nexus, disintegrated. In the streets far below, the unsunned were emerging. At first, they were just shadows, thousands of them, pouring out of the subway entrances, the sewers and the hidden mole shafts. They moved in a silent, disciplined tide, their pale skin reflecting the dying embers of the tower above. Elowen looked up. The clouds had parted completely. She saw the stars, real stars, not the distant pinpricks Jinso had seen from the void, but the vast, cold diamonds of the British night sky. And then something touched her cheek. It was cold. It was wet. She flinched, her instincts shouting poison. But then the echo provided the answer. Rain. The true grey rain of London was falling. It washed the gold leaf off the balcony railing and began to dissolve the layers of ash that had coated the city for centuries. "Elowen," Arthur's voice came through, now clear and devoid of the interference that the Hegemony's sensors used to provide. "The Hegemony fleet is grounded. Without the solar nexus, their ships are just heavy metal. They're surrendering in the ports of Dover and Liverpool. The word is spreading across the Isles." "It's not just a surrender, Arthur," Elowen whispered, watching the rain intensify into a cleansing deluge. "It's an awakening." She looked down at her hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer physical sensation of the world returning to itself. The slow pulse in her chest seemed to quicken, her heart finally finding a rhythm that didn't feel like a funeral march. Behind her, the shard of light began to crumble. Without the energy fields to support its impossible architecture, the crystal and gold were succumbing to gravity. Elowen didn't run. She stepped onto the emergency descent cable, sliding down into the dark, toward the people who had waited 800 years to see the moon. Characters: 2,596 total characters. 13,175. The descent into the streets was like falling through time. As Elowen hit the wet pavement of what was once Regent Street, she found herself surrounded by a sea of her own kind. These were the people of the deep tube, men, women, and children with skin like marble and eyes that glowed with a faint bioluminescent hue, a byproduct of the algae-based diets of the underground. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout battle cries. They stood in the rain, faces turned upward, mouths open to catch the water. It was a silent, sacred communion. Elowen saw a young boy, perhaps the 21st generation, reaching out to touch a rusted street lamp. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the echo begin to change. The memories of fire and ash were being overlaid with the sensation of the present. "Elowen Vance," a man stepped forward. It was Arthur. He looked older than he sounded over the link, his face etched with the lines of a life spent in cramped artificial light. He held a physical book, a rare relic from the archive's deepest vault. "The Hegemony is retreating to the cloud spires," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "They're trying to evacuate to their orbital platforms. But the people, they've taken the Thames. They've blocked the ports. There's nowhere for the sun gods to hide." Elowen took the book from him. Its leather cover was cracked, but the title was still legible, A History of the British Isles. "We aren't here to hunt them, Arthur. We are here to reclaim the record. We will rebuild London, not as a monument to power, but as a testament to memory." But the night wasn't over. A high-pitched whine cut through the sound of the rain. From the heights of the crumbling shard, a gold-plated gunship descended, its spotlight cutting through the dark like a dying scream. It was Kalen's personal craft. He wasn't evacuating. He was seeking vengeance. The gunship's cannons opened fire, tearing through the ancient facades of the buildings. The crowd scattered, the silence finally broken by the sounds of chaos. Elowen felt the echo flare white-hot. 1666. The burning. The end. No, she hissed, her eyes narrowing as she watched the ship pivot toward a group of children. Not again. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the archive. And the archive was connected to the city's very soul. Characters, 2,572 total characters. 15,747. Elowen ran toward a junction box. A jagged piece of hegemony tech grafted onto the side of a Victorian brick building. She slammed her hand against the interface, her slow pulse synchronizing with the fluctuating power surges of the dying grid. Arthur, I need a feedback loop. Every scrap of energy left in the shard's capacitors. Dump it into the street line. That'll burn out the local archive nodes. We'll lose the data for the Westminster sector. The people are the archive, Arthur. Do it. She felt the surge before she saw it. A massive pulse of raw, unfiltered electricity tore through the underground cables, erupting from the junction box and arcing into the wet sky. It wasn't a targeted shot. It was an environmental lash. The rain-conductive air turned the entire street into a lightning trap. The gold gunship, designed for the vacuum of space and the dry heat of the spires, was not prepared for the grounding force of a London thunderstorm. The electrical arc hit the craft's stabilizers, sending a cascade of sparks through its gold-plated hull. The whine of the engines turned into a death rattle. The ship spiraled, clipping the edge of a clock tower, Big Ben, stripped of its face but still standing, and crashed into the black waters of the Thames. A plume of steam and fire rose from the river, quickly extinguished by the relentless downpour. The street fell silent again. The threat was gone. The High Proctor, the man who had claimed to own the sun, was now a part of the river's silt. Elowen slumped against the brick wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her Vantasilk cloak was torn and soaked, but for the first time she felt warm. The echo in her mind had softened into a gentle hum, a chorus of ancestors finally finding rest. "It's over," Arthur whispered, coming to her side. "No," Elowen said, looking up as the first hint of a true, pale blue dawn began to bleed over the horizon, not the harsh gold of the hegemony, but the soft, hesitant light of a British morning. "It's the beginning." Around them, the people of the tube began to move. They didn't return to the darkness. They started picking up the debris, their movements efficient and purposeful. They were no longer refugees, they were architects. Characters, 2,522 total characters. 18,269. As the weeks passed, Neo-London began its slow transformation into the city of memory. The gold leaf was stripped from the towers, replaced by the honest textures of stone and timber. The smog had cleared entirely, revealing a landscape that was both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. Elowen Vance sat in the newly established Central Archive, located in the restored shell of the British Museum. The roof had been patched with hegemony glass, allowing the natural light to flood the corridors where generations of hidden history were finally being catalogued. "Elowen," a voice called. It was a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, her skin still pale but her cheeks showing a healthy flush of color from the surface air. "The representatives from the Scottish Highlands and the Welsh Valleys have arrived. They're bringing the deep mountain records." Elowen smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached her silver eyes. "Bring them in, Karis. Every word matters." The girl hesitated. "Do you think they'll come back? The people from the stars?" Elowen looked toward the window. In the distance, the skeletal remains of the shard of light stood like a warning. The hegemony had been driven from Earth, but the galaxy was still vast and full of predators who viewed humanity as a footnote. "They might," Elowen admitted. "But we are no longer a footnote, Karis. We are a testament. We have learned to live in the dark, and we have learned to reclaim the light. If they return, they will find a people who remember everything." She turned back to the manuscript on her desk. It was a new chapter, the first one written in 800 years that didn't describe a struggle for survival. It described the smell of the rain, the taste of the wind, and the sound of a city waking up. The echo was still there, But it was no longer a burden. It was a library. She could reach into her mind and hear the laughter of the 16th generation, the songs of the 5th, and the quiet resolve of Sloane. They were all there, living through her, watching as the blue sky stretched over London once more. Archive entry 801. Elowen began to write, her pen moving with shadow efficiency across the page. Today the sun rose. And for the first time it belonged to everyone. Characters, 2,504 total characters, 20,773. The reconstruction of the British Isles was not merely a feat of engineering, but a painstaking restoration of the soul. In the months following the solar nexus collapse, the landscape of England began to breathe again. The terraforming chemicals used by the hegemony to create their artificial tropical climate were being neutralized by the natural, persistent humidity of the British climate. Elowen Vance traveled across the country, from the reclaimed docklands of Liverpool to the silent, stone-crowned hills of the Peak District. Everywhere she went, she saw the same phenomenon: the unsunned emerging from the mines, the bunkers, and the hidden mountain complexes. In the Cotswolds, she met a community that had lived for 300 years in a labyrinth of limestone quarries. They had preserved the seeds of ancient English oaks and wildflowers in pressurized vaults. Now they were planting them in the gray, nutrient-starved soil. They won't grow for decades, an old man told her, his hands stained with the dark earth. But my grandchildren will know what a forest looks like. That is the Vance promise, isn't it? That we plant for those we will never meet. Elowen nodded, feeling the resonance of his words. It was the same philosophy Jinso's people had used in the void, making every atom count, thinking in centuries rather than years. The British remnant had become temporal architects, building a future out of the fragments of a shattered past. In London, the deep tube remained a part of the city's life, but its purpose had changed. No longer a desperate refuge, it was now a sprawling transit network and a cool sanctuary for those whose skin still struggled with the direct rays of the sun. The Baker Street station where Elowen had spent her youth was now a memorial. The old subway carriage she had called home was filled with flowers, the real ones brought in from the new nurseries. Arthur Penhaligon had become the head of the Technological Reclamation Council. He spent his days dismantling hegemony drones and repurposing their crystalline processors to build atmospheric scrubbers and medical scanners. We're not just throwing away their tech, Arthur told her during one of their rare meetings. We're Englishing it. Making it sturdy, making it last, and making it serve the people instead of the proctors. It's a bit of a botch, but it works. Elowen laughed. A bit of a botch. I think that's the most authentic thing I've heard all year. But beneath the progress there was a lingering tension. The orbital platforms of the hegemony were still there, silent and dark, drifting like ghosts against the stars. Characters, 2,746 total characters, 23,519. The question of the orbital ghosts was resolved on a crisp November evening. Elowen was back in Neo-London, now simply London again, standing on the reinforced roof of the British Museum. The city was glowing, but not with the harsh, artificial light of the hegemony. Instead, thousands of small, warm LED lanterns had been strung across the streets, a celebration of the first Guy Fawkes night in centuries. A sudden, brilliant streak of light cut across the sky, followed by another, and then dozens more. They're falling, Karis whispered, her hand clutching Elowen's. The orbital platforms were deorbiting. Deprived of the maintenance crews and the power from the ground, the hegemony's celestial palaces were finally succumbing to the Earth's pull. They didn't hit the ground. They burned up in the atmosphere, turning into a spectacular, terrifying meteor shower of gold and purple fire. The people in the streets stopped. They looked up, not with fear, but with a profound sense of closure. The last remnants of the false sun were being reduced to ash and light. The echo in Elowen's mind surged with a final, powerful image. She saw the Vance archivists of the past, standing in their dark tunnels, looking up at the dirt ceiling and imagining this very moment. She felt their satisfaction, their pride, and their peace. It's really gone now, Arthur said, joining them on the roof. The sensors show no more hegemony signatures in the solar system. They fled back to their core worlds, Elowen. They won't be back for a long, long time. And if they do? Karis asked. Arthur looked at Elowen. She stood tall, her silver eyes reflecting the fire in the sky. She looked like a queen of the underworld who had finally reclaimed her throne. Then we'll be ready, Elowen said. Because we don't just have the archive anymore. We have the sky. And we have each other. As the last of the platforms burned out, the first real snow began to fall over London. It was soft, white, and silent. It covered the ruins, the gardens, and the silent Thames. Elowen reached out and caught a flake on her tongue. Tasted like nothing, and yet it tasted like everything. The archive was closed for the night. The story of the struggle was over. The story of the peace had begun. Characters, 2,510 total characters. 26,029 spring arrived with a quiet ferocity. In the parks of London, where once there had been only grey dust and hegemony surveillance pillars, the first green shoots of the Vance oaks began to break through the soil. The city was a patchwork of the old and the new, Victorian brickwork cleaned of centuries of soot, glass and steel hegemony shells repurposed into vertical farms, and the sprawling, vibrant life of the tube markets. Elowen Vance found herself walking through St. James's Park. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the budding cherry blossoms that had miraculously survived as seeds in the archive's vaults. She wasn't wearing her Vantasilk cloak anymore. Instead, she wore a simple, sturdy coat of wool, dyed a deep forest green. She sat on a wooden bench, crafted from the timbers of a decommissioned hegemony transport, and watched a group of children playing. They were a new generation, their skin tanned by the soft English sun, their laughter echoing across the grass. They didn't have the slow pulse or the bioluminescent eyes of their parents. Evolution was already pivoting back, adapting to the light. "You look like you're thinking about the 25th generation," a voice said. Elowen looked up. Arthur was standing there, holding 2 cups of steaming tea. He looked rested, the deep shadows under his eyes finally fading. "I was thinking about the first generation," Elowen admitted, taking the cup. "The ones who fled into the tunnels while the city burned. I wonder if they ever dared to dream of a Tuesday morning as boring as this one." Arthur sat beside her. "Boring is a luxury, Elle. It's the highest form of justice we could have given them." They sat in silence for a while, sipping the tea. It was a bit of a bodge, made from synthesized leaves and mountain herbs, but it was warm and it was theirs. "The council wants to name the new library after you," Arthur said. Elowen shook her head. "No. Name it after Sloane. And the thousands of others whose names we don't know yet. I'm just the one who was left to write it down." "You did more than write it down, Elowen. You were the bridge." Elowen looked at her hands. They were steady now. The echo hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer a haunting. It was a conversation. She could feel the presence of her ancestors like a warm shawl around her shoulders. They were satisfied. "What will you do now?" Arthur asked. "The archive is stable. The city is growing. You could just live." Characters, 2,752 total characters. 28,781. Elowen looked toward the horizon, where the skeletal remains of the Shard of Light were being dismantled by a swarm of repurposed construction drones. "I think I'd like to see the sea, Arthur. The real sea. Not the toxic sludge in the Thames, but the white cliffs and the gray waves of the Channel." "I'll get a transport ready," Arthur said, smiling. "No," Elowen said, standing up. "I want to walk. I want to feel every mile of this land under my feet. I want to see the wildflowers blooming in the craters and the sheep grazing in the ruins of the hegemony outposts. I want to know exactly what we've reclaimed." She left the park and headed south. As she walked through the streets of London, people nodded to her. Not as a commander, but as a neighbor. The unsunned were no longer a hidden species. They were the heart of a New England, a people forged in the dark and tempered by the rain. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, the sun was setting. It wasn't the violent purple of the hegemony's filters. It was a soft, bruised gold, fading into a deep regal indigo. Elowen stopped on a hill overlooking the North Downs. The landscape stretched before her, a tapestry of shadow and emerging light. She felt the echo one last time. A collective sigh of relief from 3,000 generations of Vance archivists. Their journey was over. The archive of ash was complete. Elowen took out a small notebook from her pocket, the one she used for her own thoughts, the ones that didn't belong to the ancestors. She wrote a single line. "The rain has stopped, the stars are out, And the earth is ours again. She closed the notebook and kept walking, her footsteps light and purposeful. Behind her, the lights of London twinkled like a new galaxy, a testament to the fact that even after 60,000 years, or 800, humanity would always find its way back to the light. The story was no longer about what they had lost. It was about what they were building. And as the moon rose over the English countryside, silver and silent, Elowen Vance finally knew what it felt like to be home. Characters: 2,362 total characters. 31,143. The journey to the coast took Elowen through the scars of Kent. This region had once been a sprawling orchard, but the hegemony had paved it over with massive, obsidian flat landing strips for their heavy atmospheric lifters. Now the concrete was cracking. Nature was reclaiming the runway with a quiet, unstoppable force. Tiny dandelions and tough, wiry grass pushed through the fissures, shattering the hegemony's perfection with their chaotic life. She stayed one night in a village called Sevenoaks, though only 2 of the namesake trees remained. The people there lived in the shells of old cargo containers, which they had painted with vibrant murals of the sky they had missed for so long. They shared their food with her, a stew of synthesized protein and real earth-grown potatoes. "We heard about the shard," a woman told her, her eyes bright with the deep tube bioluminescence that was slowly fading in the next generation. "We heard the archive is open. Is it true? Can we find our names?" "Every name we could salvage is there," Elowen assured her. "And if your name isn't there, you have the right to write it in yourself. The archive is no longer a secret. It's a ledger of the living." The woman wept then, and Elowen held her. It was a different kind of duty than the one she had performed in the solar nexus. This was the duty of the witness. As Elowen reached the white cliffs of Dover, the wind picked up, carrying the sharp, cold spray of the English Channel. She stood on the edge of the chalk precipice, looking out over the water. The sea was a turbulent, magnificent gray, its waves crashing against the rocks with a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the world. Far out on the horizon, she saw the shapes of old hegemony wreckage being salvaged by human-crewed barges. They were building a new fleet, not a fleet for war or for fleeing into the void, but for exploration and trade. They were reaching out to the rest of the world, connecting with the other remnants in Europe and beyond. Elowen felt a presence beside her. It was the echo, but it had changed. It no longer felt like a choir of voices. It felt like a single quiet thought. "It is enough." She looked at the white chalk beneath her boots. This was the edge of her world, the boundary of the home they had fought for. She felt the weight of the 8 centuries lift from her heart, dispersing like the sea mist in the morning sun. Characters: 2,682 total characters. 33,825 in the year that followed. Elowen Vance became a legend, though she did her best to avoid the title. She returned to London only occasionally, spending most of her time traveling between the new settlements, helping to establish the oral archive schools. She wanted to ensure that even if the technology failed again, the memory of who they were would remain in the minds of the children. She was in the Peak District when she received a message from Arthur. It wasn't through a neural link. Those had been largely phased out in favor of physical, more human communication. It was a handwritten letter, delivered by a young man on a bicycle. It read, "We've found something. In the deepest vaults of the shard's foundations, beneath the atmospheric scrubbers. It's a message. Not from the hegemony but from the ones before. The ones who saw the fire coming. You need to see this." Elowen traveled back to London. The city was unrecognizable from the Neo-London she had first infiltrated. It was green. It was vibrant. It was noisy. The Shard of Light was now a hollowed-out monument, its crystalline walls covered in climbing ivy. She met Arthur in the subbasement of the tower. He was standing in a small stone room that looked older than the hegemony's architecture. On the wall was a simple, etched plaque. "The hegemony built their tower right on top of it," Arthur whispered, shining a torch on the metal. "They probably thought it was just rubble." Elowen read the words. They were in English, ancient and weathered. "To those who follow. The fire is coming but the earth remains. We have hidden the seeds and the stories. Do not let the dark make you forget the sun. Do not let the sun make you forget the dark. Stay human." Elowen touched the cold metal. "They knew," she whispered. "The first generation. They knew we would find our way back. They weren't just fleeing Arthur said. They were planting us. We were the seed. Elowen looked around the small dark room. Felt like the tube, yet it felt like a temple. She realized then that the long journey wasn't a tragedy. It was a victory. Humanity hadn't just survived. They had endured with their identity intact, preserved through the fire and the ash like a diamond. She stepped out of the basement and into the London afternoon. The sun was shining through a light rain, creating a brilliant rainbow over the Thames. Elowen Vance, the 20th Archivist, the Shadow Walker, the bridge between worlds, took a deep breath of the damp, sweet air. Archive entry 1200, she said softly to the wind. We have remembered. And we are here. Characters, 2,756 total characters. 36,581. The final chapter of the Archive of Ash was not written by Elowen, but by the people themselves. It was written in the way they built their homes, the way they told their stories, and the way they looked at the stars without flinching. Elowen eventually settled in a small cottage on the coast of Cornwall, within sight of the sea she loved. She spent her days gardening, growing real lavender and rosemary, and her evenings teaching the local children the songs of the tube, turning the grim survivalist chants into melodies of triumph. One evening Karis, now a young woman, came to visit her. She was a teacher in London now, leading the very schools Elowen had founded. Elowen, Karis said as they sat on the porch watching the tide come in, the people are asking for a final entry, a conclusion to the archive. They want to know what the ultimate lesson was. Elowen looked at her hands, now weathered by the sun and the soil. She thought about Jinso and her fleet in the distant void. She thought about Sloane and her sacrifice in the solar nexus. She thought about the millions of voices in the echo who had finally found their peace. She took a piece of paper and wrote the final entry of the Archive of Ash. The lesson is this. No power in the galaxy can erase a people who carry their home within them. We lived in the dark, and we did not become the dark. We saw the sun, and we did not let it burn us. We are the survivors of the ash, the keepers of the rain, and the masters of our own memory. The sky was never theirs to take, because the sky lives in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. She handed the paper to Karis. Give them this. And tell them the archive is no longer a record of what was. It is a blank page for what will be. Karis read the words, her eyes filling with tears. She hugged Elowen, a long, tight embrace that bridged the generations. As Karis walked away toward the lights of the village, Elowen stood on the porch. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver path across the gray Atlantic. The air was cold, the wind was sharp, and the world was beautiful. Elowen Vance closed her eyes. The echo was silent now, replaced by the simple rhythmic sound of the waves. She took one last deep breath of the sea air and smiled. She was home. Characters, 2,476 total characters. 39,057. The night was perfectly still. Elowen watched the silver path on the water until the moon began its slow descent. She felt a profound sense of completeness, as if a great circle had finally closed. The archive was no longer a weight she carried. It was the foundation she stood upon. She went inside her cottage and lit a single candle. The light was small, but it was enough to illuminate the room. A room filled with physical books, dried flowers, and sketches of the new London. She sat at her small wooden desk and opened her notebook one last time. She didn't write about war. She didn't write about the hegemony. She wrote about the way the light changed on the white cliffs in the morning. She wrote about the taste of a real apple. She wrote about the sound of a child who didn't know what a slow pulse was. Archive supplemental, she whispered as she wrote. The world is loud again. It is messy, it is cold, and it is unpredictable. It is exactly as it should be. She set the pen down. Outside, a night owl called, a sound that her ancestors had only known through digital recordings, but which was now a part of her nightly reality. Elowen blew out the candle. In the darkness, her eyes didn't glow. The bioluminescence had faded, her body finally letting go of the adaptations of the deep tunnels. She was just a woman in a quiet house in a free land. And as she drifted into a sleep free of the echo, she knew that the story of the archive would live on, not in the books, but in the breath of every person who walked under the English sky. Justice had been served. Memory had been preserved. The ash had been washed away, and in its place the world was growing. Characters: 1,842 total characters. 40,899, so with circumflex u twin sang to with tilde hana with graving.